So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. I'll move this here a little bit. My name is Brian Hurley. I'm special counsel in the Competition Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau here at the FCC. And I am also the designated federal officer of the BDAC. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Brian. Yes, so I'm Paul Dari, and I'm the Deputy Designated Federal Officer of the BDAC, and I'm also in the Competition Infrastructure Policy Division of the Wireless Bureau.
We both are very excited and look forward to working with all of you in the months ahead. But without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, Elizabeth Pierce. And at this point, she will take over control of the meeting with the ceremonial pounding of the gavel.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Pierce. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Quintillion, which is a unique little company in Alaska building a fiber optic cable system that no one said could be done. And I'd like to introduce my Vice Chair, Kelly Cole. Kelly?
Yeah, I'm Kelly Cole, and I am with the Utah Governor's Office of Economic Development, and I'm also the Director of the Broadband Outreach Center in the state of Utah, and I'm the Vice Chair of this committee.
Thank you. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce FCC Chairman Ajit Pai and to ask the Chairman to give us a few comments.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, or Chairwoman Pierce, rather, for that very kind introduction. I'm just so excited to be here this morning to see the array of talent from across the industry, from across the country, who have come to the agency for the purpose of advising us on broadband deployment. You know, last September at a startup accelerator in Cincinnati, I outlined what I called a digital empowerment agenda, which was what I intended to be a nonpartisan blueprint for communications policy. And at the core of that agenda was my firm conviction that every American who wants high-speed internet access should be able to get it, regardless of who he or she is, regardless of where he or she lives, and regardless of any other situation in which that individual might find himself or herself. And so I suggested several concrete proposals for achieving that goal, for promoting broadband deployment across the country and closing what I've called the digital divide. Now, one proposal within that digital empowerment agenda was the creation of a broadband deployment advisory committee, which I envisioned to be a panel of experts that could advise us on these issues. And so how marvelous it is to see this idea put into practice this morning, to see all of these talented individuals sitting in this room. It's quite fitting as well that this first meeting of the BDAC is taking place during Infrastructure Month here at the FCC. Now, you know much better than I that deploying broadband is hard, and it is expensive, and it is time-consuming work, whether you are trenching fiber, whether you are attaching equipment to poles, or whether you're setting up a gateway earth station. And in my view, at least, red tape shouldn't make that task harder than it otherwise has to be. To me, it's pretty simple. With rules that make it easier to deploy broadband, we will see more broadband deployed. And in turn, we can empower millions of Americans with digital opportunity, Americans who heretofore haven't had it. Now, when we issued a call for nominations to serve on the BDAC back in January, I was expecting a trickle of a dozen or a few dozen applications. I couldn't be more thrilled at how wrong my prediction was. We got over 380 applications from individuals from around the country. These were nominees from organizations large and small, representing industry, government, and consumer and community organizations. And from this diverse and highly impressive pool of applicants, we invited a lucky 29, or unluckily, depending on how you see the assignments we were about to impose upon you, to serve on this new committee. Thank you for accepting this responsibility. I fully recognize that you have dedicated yourselves to your jobs and your families back home, and to spend extra time here at the agency laboring in these waters is something that I am deeply and personally grateful for. It goes without saying that you are a very distinguished group. You are innovators and leaders in the effort to bring broadband and next-generation networks generally to all parts of this nation. Your work connects rural and urban areas alike. It links people across land and air and sea. And you turn today's dreams into tomorrow's realities. I simply talk about broadband here at the FCC. You do it across the country, and that is no small feat. And so I think we are excited that you are joining us in this calling, and I look forward to working with you closely. Now, as members of the BDAC, your mission is to give the FCC recommendations on ways to spur broadband deployment and to reduce barriers to investment. And one important part of this work, I think, which I previewed last fall, is to develop model codes for state and local governments that want to encourage deployment and competitive entry in their jurisdictions. And in fact, the BDAC is being asked to develop 2 model codes, one for municipalities and one for states. And in developing each, the goal should be guidelines that are forward-looking and fair, and that balance the legitimate interests of state and local governments with the ever-growing demands of the American public for better and faster and cheaper internet. And so I look forward to seeing how you approach this challenge. The BDAC will also be asked to make recommendations on how to promote competitive access to broadband infrastructure, including utility poles. It might not be all that exciting to the outside world, but is a critical part of the infrastructure equation, as you know. And new concepts such as One Touch Make Ready or Right Touch Make Ready have great potential to streamline the pole attachment process. The BDAC could help identify solutions for easing access that preserve public safety and advance the interests of pole owners and pole users or would-be users alike. Another key issue is speeding up broadband deployment on federal lands. And right now it takes about twice as long on average to site infrastructure on federal lands as it does on privately held land. And shortening that timeline could help prove the business case for deployment in areas where it might not otherwise exist. And here, BDAC recommendations could have a major impact on closing the digital divide, especially for rural and tribal residents who live on or near federal lands. Now, the thicket of issues I've identified and a few others that I'm sure you'll get into make one thing perfectly clear. The BDAC, you have a lot of work in front of you. But I'm certain that this distinguished group is more than up to the task, and in the coming weeks, I expect to appoint more qualified appointees to round out the working groups, leading further support to the cause to which you have devoted yourselves. So thank you once again for contributing your time, your energy, and your expertise to this important endeavor. Thanks to our distinguished chair and vice chair for leading this very impressive herd of cats. And I'm confident that your dedication to this committee will serve the FCC and the American public very well in the years to come. So thanks for your indulgence.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. We do plan to have comments from the other commissioners when they become available. At this time, I'd like to start and have the BDAC committee members introduce themselves, and we'll proceed with that at this time. If we can start over here with Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Adelstein, President and CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, and couldn't be more thrilled to be here. Thank you for the offer. And every month is Infrastructure Month at WIA, but we are thrilled that you created one here, and you're actually making a huge difference with an incredible array of activity, not just the BDAC, but yesterday's action by the Commission and action on the petition that's pending. We are thrilled. You couldn't be more supportive of improving access to broadband, so thank you for making us part of this.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I am Alan Bell. I work with Georgia Power, which is an affiliate of Southern Company. We're very glad that we were invited to be part of this. We really appreciate being at the table because we do understand the role that we're going to play in broadband deployment.
Morning. I'm Chris Bondurant. I'm the Assistant Vice President of AT&T Construction and Engineering for the Midwest. So we currently have 14 states. Looking forward to working with this team to encourage broadband growth. Certainly, we know the challenges are in front of us because I'm the one in the trenches, so I do the construction on a day-to-day basis. So thank you.
And oh, okay, thank you, Commissioner. Okay, sorry, we'll continue with brief introductions of the committee, and then we'll hear from Commissioner Clyburn. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Elizabeth Bowles, and I'm with Aristotle. We're a fixed wireless provider at WISP in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm very honored to be selected for this committee and looking forward to the work ahead.
Hi, I'm Bob DeBrew with TDS Telecom. We are primarily an ILEC in 25 states, but in rural areas, but we also own a few cable companies, and we are a CLEC as well, and we have a sister company. Our overall parent is Telephone and Data Systems, and our sister company is U.S. Cellular, so I'm somewhat familiar with wireless industries as well. I did a lot of work in the last few years in the universal service space and actually started out my life in telecommunications as a regulator at the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. So I'm kind of a 360 person in terms of seeing all the different perspectives.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Doug Dimitroff, representing New York State Wireless Association. From what we consider a pretty diverse state, from large cities to rural and forever wild areas. So very much looking forward to participating and meeting all of you.
Hi, I'm David Don. I'm with Comcast. For those who don't know, we're the largest wireline residential ISP in the country. We work with many of you around this table, and I look forward to working with you here at the BDAC to see how we can improve broadband deployment throughout the country.
Good morning. I'm Valerie Fasthorse. I'm the Director of IT for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe and also a Coeur d'Alene tribal member. And I've been working on broadband deployment since 1999 and have deployed fixed wireless and fiber optics on my reservation. And I look forward to working with all of you guys on improving and streamlining broadband access on any lands.
Good morning. My name is Jamie Fink. I'm with Mimosa Networks. We are a Silicon Valley-based startup focused entirely on fixed wireless delivery for both rural and urban areas and for ISPs particularly, and as well as working with utility companies. So.
Good morning. I'm Mark Gansey. I'm Executive Chairman of Exonet Systems. We're based in Lisle, Illinois. We're the largest private small cell operator in the United States. We own and operate over 1,100 networks, 18,000 nodes, 3,000 fiber miles, and we've been doing it for about 13 years. It's a pleasure to be of your service again. And last time we worked together, we got a great piece of legislation done in the Rockefeller bill, and looking forward to being of service to you again and hopefully creating some great legislation.
Good morning. I'm Carlos Gutierrez from LGBT Technology Partnership and Institute. We are a nonprofit that works across the intersection of LGBT and technology issues. And with regards to broadband, we have a special interest in underserved LGBT communities, such as rural communities.
Thank you, Betsy. Hi, I'm Michael Hain from Nittany Media. We're a small cable operator. I was wondering why I was on the panel, but I understand that. Well, let's see. We've been in business since 1957. We deployed broadband for our school district in 1996. We did it as a community service project because our kids go to school there, and it's our community. We use what we call appropriate technology. We do fixed wireless. We just retired our dial-up just in January after 3 months of no logins. But fiber is where we're moving toward. We have, of course, DOCSIS we deployed in 99, but it's a small cable operator, Central Pennsylvania. Thank you. And I'm very glad to be here, and I'm glad to see the initiative that we're taking, because rural broadband really does make a difference when we bring the opportunities there. The mom and pop businesses can go global with their marketing, and it really is a boon for our economic development. Thank you, Betsy.
I'm Betsy Huber with the National Grange. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, fraternal organization, grassroots. We have chapters, 2,000 chapters across the country in 37 states. We've been advocating for rural broadband for many years, and I'm very happy to be here.
Mark Hudson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Rocket Fiber. We are a fiber optic and wireless internet service provider out of Detroit, Michigan. We're part of the Quicken Loans Rock Ventures family of companies. And we're just super excited to be here. Detroit, just so everyone has the background, is literally the city with the largest digital divide of any major American city in the United States. We have 60% of our residents without fixed line broadband access at home. So we've seen the challenges, and we're very excited to be part of this committee and make recommendations and can help move that forward.
My name is Kim Keenan, and I'm the President and CEO of Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. We're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan advocacy group that focuses on closing the digital divide, among many other things, but I'll just focus on that and how important it is that if we're going to have a digital economy, that everyone have access to it. And so I am really thrilled and honored to be a part of this committee.
I'm Jeffrey Manny. I'm the founder and executive director of the International Center for Law and Economics. I don't build anything, but I do criticize governments that make it harder for others to build things. ICLE is Portland, Oregon-based policy, research, and consumer advocacy center.
I'm Kelly McGriff. I'm General Counsel of Southern Light. We're based in Mobile, Alabama. We have a network over 5 states and about 6,000 network miles. We'll be moving forward as Unity Fiber with service in 15 states and over 60,000 miles. We're very excited about this next phase. I do build, but I also criticize, mainly because I build. Yeah, mainly because I build. And I'm so looking for, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this initiative, and we've talked a lot about all of the issues that we have in all of the municipalities and states that we operate in Hammond, Louisiana, as you mucked around in the bayou and other places, and we're looking forward to working to create some legislation that hopefully will make it easier to bring broadband to everybody in the United States. Thank you.
I'm Milo Medine. I'm Vice President of Access Services at Alphabet, and I work with a number of programs, including things like Google Fiber, as well as a number of wireless systems. And it's great to be here. I'm an engineer, which in some of these forums makes for interesting conversations, but I have physics on my side. So thank you.
Sure.
Hello, I'm Brian Mefford, founder of Connected Nation and currently CEO of CNX, a spin-out company. And it's a pleasure to be with you and really look forward to working with this group. Our focus today is in bridging the gap between carriers and cities, particularly with respect to small cell, pre-5G, 5G build-out, as well as fiber. I have to say, when I started in advocating for broadband, nearly 15 years ago, in parts of Appalachia, particularly Kentucky, we were assessing the availability of 56K speeds at that point. So it's a pleasure to be in some of those same places advocating and working on gigabit speeds. And so obviously there are still large gaps between those things, but appreciate the chairman's vision for establishing this group. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Karen Charles Peterson, the Commissioner for the Department of Telecom and Cable for Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a member of NAVRUC. I'm sitting on this committee as the NAVRUC representative. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to be working with everyone here.
John Saw, I'm CTO for Sprint. Sprint is a national provider of wireless and wireline services based in Kansas. Almost 10 years ago, I led the team that built one of the first 4G wireless networks, and I really look forward to work as part of the BDAC to build the next generation wireless networks of 5G.
I'm Ken Simon, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Crown Castle International. We're based in Houston. We are the largest owner of cell phone towers in the country and one of the leaders in the implementation of small cells and fiber in the country, and certainly the fiber and small cells that we are deploying will be very significant in terms of supporting the future of 5G, Internet of Things, fixed wireless, and all the good things to come here in the future. We're delighted to be part of the committee, really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and look forward to working towards what we consider to be some win-win solutions as we go forward, which we think are absolutely possible. So, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Brent Skorup. I'm at the Mercatus Center, which is a research center at George Mason University, right across the river here. And my portfolio covers tech, telecom, and competition issues, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning. I'm Larry Thompson. I'm the founder and CEO of Vantage Point Solutions. Vantage Point does both wireless and wireline engineering. We've been doing for 15 years, since Vantage Point started, been doing fiber to the home. I'm actually being sponsored by NECA, but the attorneys have told me, for full disclosure, we do work for a lot of companies other than NECA, including some that are here, like Google Fiber and Rocket Fiber. So we do a lot of work in the rural space, but we do a fair amount in the urban areas as well, and we do it from the beginning to the end. So we are involved in the permitting and the regulations, the rights of way, and things like that. So we kind of see a lot of aspects of those fiber and wireless builds.
My name is Christopher Yu. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, where I have a fairly unique distinction. I'm one of the few people that holds appointments in 3 schools. I am primarily trained in law, but I also teach in engineering and communications and do a great deal of my work in economic analysis. What I see my main contribution to this committee, I've actually done some work on pole attachments pricing going back about 20 years. But more importantly, I'm doing modern empirical studies about different employment approaches, trying to study their cost effectiveness, tying them not only into how we deploy, but in terms of outcomes on the social metrics such as healthcare, education, gender impact, financial empowerment, and the like. And equally importantly, what I hope will be useful is we're doing cross-country comparisons to draw on the experiences from other countries as well.
Hi, I'm Dolan Beckel. I am with the City of San Jose. I am in alternate land here. I'm an alternate for Mayor Sam Liccardo, who could not make it due to a funeral. But I'd like to read a brief statement. Fellow Broadband Deployment Advisor Committee members, first of all, I'd like to apologize for not being able to attend the first meeting, and I look forward to meeting you at the next quarterly meeting. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Pai for his appointment. San Jose is the largest city in Silicon Valley. It's the 10th largest city in the United States, and it's the home of the most innovative companies in our country. Our technology companies serve as engines for economic growth in our region and our country, and they are increasingly demanding enhanced bandwidth. This is particularly important for startups and the next generation entrepreneurs to drive continual innovation. As the only elected official on this committee, I will advocate for cities and their stake in both the challenges and the opportunities of deploying broadband infrastructure. Briefly, during my tenure, my top priorities will be 1, ensuring that local residents retain control over the city infrastructure they paid for. Number 2, advancing digital inclusion and affordable broadband access. Number 3, facilitating the deployment of broadband services with increased bandwidth at gigabit speeds. And 4, providing local governments with increased knowledge capital to manage the demands of broadband deployment, including but not limited to technical assistance and best practices. Again, I want to thank Chairman Pai, and I look forward to working with Chairman Dimitrov on the Model Code for Municipalities work group.
Good morning. I'm Martha Duggan. I'm here as an alternate for Jim Matheson, who's the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Mr. Matheson sends his apologies to Chairman Pai and Chair Pierce that he cannot be here for this first meeting, but very much looking forward to working with all the stakeholders on these important issues. NRECA is the national organization for 900 plus rural electric cooperatives that serve in 47 states and whose facilities span 75% of the U.S. landmass. Our members are very interested in serving our communities, getting broadband ubiquitous throughout rural America, and we're delighted to have been appointed to this committee and look forward to working with all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, committee members. At this time, I'd like to invite Commissioner Clyburn to make her welcome comments.
Thank you, Ms. Pierce. Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure it is for me to witness today's launch. Each of you has been charged by the chairman with making progress on one of the core questions those of us who take our public interest obligations seriously we've been asking for years. How do we get robust, affordable broadband to all Americans? Broadband is an essential communication service in the 21st century, and we must ensure that those who are stuck on the wrong side of the digital and opportunities divide today do not remain so. You are key to ensuring that the voices of the American people are represented, and my request to you today is a simple one. Put consumers first. Whether you are discussing how to address the thorny issues of access to poles, ducts, or conduits, I ask you to think about the impact your decisions will have on consumers. Whether you are debating franchise model codes, when you're doing that, I ask you to think about the impact of the contours of that code and what they will have on consumers in the franchise area. In particular, I ask you to keep the following 3 points in mind. First, never overlook the effects of your policy recommendations on ensuring low-income communities are not relegated to a second-class broadband future. I am sure you have seen the maps and the studies, which show that sometimes the poorest among us get the worst broadband service. And while I am well aware of the challenges that face providers looking to enable services in the areas that are least able to pay, your mission, and you've decided to accept it, is to look for solutions to this challenge. You must ensure that the policies you recommend will mend rather than make worse long-standing digital and opportunities divides. Second, I ask you to make sure that the broadband services you recommend for deployment are affordable. I believe this will work best if we each look at the problem through a means-tested lens. Will low-income households and communities be able to take advantage of this next-generation infrastructure? We should ask ourselves that. Will they be able to sign up for broadband and participate in the digital economy? If broadband is truly the greatest equalizer of our time, and I believe that it is, that many, they've held it out to be, how cruel would it be for us to deny access to those who would benefit the most? Build affordability of service into any equation you come up with. And I believe you will find that consumers and broadband providers alike will reap the benefits. Third and finally, remember that one person's regulatory barrier is another's vital consumer protection. And that one person intransigent municipality is another's carefully considered protector of local interests. The infrastructure notices we adopted yesterday frame many things that I would consider to be consumer protections, or look at consumer protections as regulatory barriers. Not trying to start another conflict. I just wanted to let you know I haven't changed much since yesterday. But as you debate among you how to streamline processes of all sorts, remember that time is necessary for consumers to make informed decisions about what to do when the provider says their legacy landline phone service is being turned off. As you determine how to draft a model municipal tower siting code, remember that all municipalities are not created equal. Cast a wide net for ideas and understanding so that we will not end up with a one-size-fits-all solution that ends up being a one-size-fits-only a few. I think I speak for all of the commissioners when I say that we have high hopes and expectations of this committee. But today, allow me to simply close by saying thank you. Thank you for volunteering your time and efforts. We're tackling extremely complex issues, but I have no doubt that with this assembly, that this will be time well spent and that we will each be beneficiaries of what you deliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I'd like to introduce Commissioner O'Reilly.
I'm going to be a little unorthodox. Apologize for standing up here on top of everybody, including the chairman. I tell you, this does feel kind of interesting, though, Mr. Chairman. I won't get too comfortable. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to spend the entire time with you. I did get the introductions. I was standing in the back and got the introductions. It's a pleasure to hear your backgrounds. And I will watch this, so I'll probably be one of the few that watches this on streaming as it gets posted. But I have a couple comments, and then I'll let you get to work. My sincere thanks to the chairman for inviting me to join you all today to address the inaugural meeting of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. The chairman deserves great credit for bringing his proposal to fruition by creating this panel. A heartfelt welcome to all of the appointees and their staff and guests for not only being here today, but for your willingness to participate, knowing that this work may take time away from your full-time jobs and or your families. The issues before this new advisory committee are significant. The Commission is asking for your expertise to help us identify remaining barriers preventing the deployment of broadband services nationwide and to propose discrete solutions. Having worked on these issues for quite a while, let me share with you that there is no one answer to either of these tasks. From weather and terrain to remoteness to jurisdictional fights and local power grabs, our nation's broadband providers face a litany of obstacles that prevent all Americans from having access to sufficient broadband services. The good news is that the Commission has already taken a number of steps in this area, and more are in the pipeline, thanks to the chairman. At the same time, we must not ignore the great progress that has already been made in broadband build-out. While not everyone has access to broadband today, we have seen tremendous advances in bringing service to previously unserved areas. Some of this has been the result of the Commission's Universal Service Program and decisions made over the last many years. The vast amount of recent success deployments, however, have been made by private sector companies willing to put capital at risk, purchasing equipment and hiring employees to physically expand or upgrade necessary equipment and networks in order to initiate services. That's the American way, and we shouldn't lose sight of it in our desire to expand or pursue expedited build-out. In other words, we would never support nationalizing the broadband industry or creating new monopolies in exchange for faster and greater build-out to unserved areas. In addition, I hope this committee will take a holistic approach when reviewing possible technology solutions. The Commission has tried to maintain a principle near and dear to me of technology neutrality. Clearly, it is not economically feasible to drag fiber to every unserved location. Instead, it will take multiple technologies. Well, this may make your review that much more difficult and challenging. Accepting and honoring this reality will best serve everyone in the long run. A word of warning as you prepare to examine these issues and possible solutions. At some point, I'm sure, someone will argue that one solution is just to throw money at the problem. In this case, the money they talk about comes from consumers in the form of higher service fees than are necessary. I'll be extremely reluctant to consider any recommendation that proposes to increase costs on everyday Americans trying to survive in today's economy. In establishing this new panel, I appreciate the chairman's direction to return to past practices of how advisory committees are run. This means the Commission assigns issues to the committee to examine, but then steps back and awaits your views and recommendations. Our role is not to be overly involved and certainly not to prescribe what you should find or recommend. The members of the committee should be given wide latitude to make the best recommendations based on the information available and their personal experiences. So let me end where I began, by thanking you so very much for taking on this task and your good work to come. I look forward to interacting with each of you in the months ahead and reading your recommendations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Okay, at this time we have some administrative matters to take care of, so I'm going to ask Brian to go ahead.
So just quickly, just if there's anyone who has any ethical disclosures to make after having consulted with our general counsel's office and didn't take that opportunity the first time we went around, if anyone would like to do so now, please feel free.
I'm just picking up from where Mr. Thompson left off. So I will disclose that I'm also a private lawyer. But here representing New York State Wireless Association.
Okay, thank you, Doug.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I will also disclose that I am a CEO of a holding corporation that owns other businesses in communications infrastructure. Namely, we own a very large private cell tower REIT. We own 2 large data center companies in the United States, and then we have holdings, 2 tower companies that are international as well. But I'm serving here in the capacity as Executive Chairman of ExNet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Right, thank you. At this time, we're going to ask Chris Monteith, Acting Chair of the Wireline Competition Bureau, to address the committee.
Good morning and welcome to the Federal Communications Commission. My message really is one of thanks. And first I want to thank Chairman Pai for his vision in thinking about these issues and in proposing this advisory committee and for charging the Wireline Competition Bureau with setting it up. My second thank you is to all of you around the table for for being willing to share your expertise, your knowledge, your time to help us in this endeavor and to help us with recommendations in terms of how we can advance the Chairman's digital empowerment agenda. My third thank you is to Elizabeth and to Kelly for agreeing to chair this Federal Advisory Committee. We greatly appreciate, again, your willingness to share your time and your energy and your thoughts. Next, I have to thank Brian and Paul for willing to serve as the DFO and the assistant DFO. I don't know how aware you are, but it is a lot of work, can be a daunting task to be the DFO and the assistant DFO to a Federal Advisory Committee, particularly if the Federal Advisory Committee is one who has significant work in front of it, as this committee does. So I very much thank them. They have already put a significant amount of work into making today happen, and I know they will be equally busy and dedicated and committed as the committee's work moves forward. Next, I'd like to introduce a couple of members of the Wireline Competition Bureau who are here, and really we want to, and what I'm trying to do is put our names and faces before you. We are the folks that work on broadband issues for the Wireline Competition Bureau and for the Commission, and we are here to support you in your work. So Madeline Finley, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief in the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Dan Kahn, who is the Chief of our Competition Policy Division, and Steve Rosenberg, who is the Bureau's Chief Data Officer. And so think of them and use them as a resource as you're doing your work. And really, the Wireline Competition Bureau is all about broadband and deploying broadband and how we can get broadband to all Americans. From our Competition Policy Division, which Dan is the division chief, that, for example, was the division that worked on and presented yesterday the infrastructure notice of proposed rulemaking and notice of inquiry. to our Telecommunications Access Policy Division, which works on universal service issues and the high-cost issues. Our Pricing Policy Division also has a role in broadband deployment from a pricing policy standpoint. Our Industry Analysis and Technology Division, which does a lot of the analytics and collection of data to help inform us as we make important policy decisions. We are all very integrally involved in this effort and this objective on behalf of the chairman and the Federal Communications Commission. So I will not keep you from the important work you have before you, but I did want to emphasize that we are your staff. So use us accordingly. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Chris. We'll now hear from Deborah Salons, who will give us a summary of the FCC rulemaking proceedings relevant to this committee.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to get the slides set up. Great. Hello, my name is Deborah Salons. I'm an attorney advisor in the Wireline Competition Bureau Competition Policy Division, and I'm an attorney on the BDAC team. I'm also one of the attorneys that worked on the Wireline infrastructure item that I'm going to talk to you about today. The Wireline infrastructure item adopted yesterday and entitled Removing Barriers to Wireline Infrastructure Investment explores a number of ways to accelerate the deployment of next-generation wireline networks and services by removing barriers to infrastructure investment and streamlining the regulatory processes associated with transitioning these to more modern, innovative networks and services. As we all know, high-speed broadband is an increasingly important gateway to jobs, healthcare, education, and information. Access to high-speed broadband is essential to creating economic opportunity for all Americans. Streamlining rules, accelerating approvals, and removing other barriers where possible will better enable broadband providers to build, maintain, and upgrade their networks, which in turn will lead to more affordable and accessible internet access and other broadband services for consumers and businesses alike. As a general overview, the item proposes a number of actions designated to accelerate the deployment of next-generation networks and services by removing barriers to infrastructure investment at the federal, state, and local level, the transition from legacy copper networks and services to next-generation networks and services, and the elimination of commission regulations that increase costs and slow broadband deployment. More specifically, the Wireline item contains 3 parts: a notice of proposed rulemaking, a notice of inquiry, and a request for comment. The notice of proposed rulemaking proposes rules related to pole attachment reforms, expediting the copper retirement process, and streamlining the Section 214A discontinuation process. The notice of inquiry asks questions and seeks comments on using Section 253 authority to preempt state and local laws inhibiting broadband deployment, and preemption of state laws governing copper retirement. The request for comment seeks comment on revisiting a previous declaratory ruling expanding the interpretation of what constitutes a service for purposes of Section 214A discontinuance process. There's a lot in this item, and I'm going to give you a quick summary of each section. As previously mentioned, the NPRM proposes rules related to pole attachments, the retiring of legacy copper facilities, and the discontinuance process. To start, the NPRM proposes to reform the FCC's pole attachment rules to make it easier, faster, and less costly to access poles, ducts, conduits, and rights-of-way necessary for building out next-generation networks. First, it proposes to shorten the Commission's existing pole attachment timeline and seeks comments on alternatives to the current pole attachment process. This could reduce the average process from 150 days, 5 months, to 30 to 60 days. The notice also proposes changes to the Commission's pole attachment rules that would reduce make-ready charges paid by attachers to utilities. And as a reference, make-ready generally refers to the modification of poles or lines or the installation of certain equipment like guys or anchors to accommodate additional facilities. Other proposed changes would codify the elimination of certain capital costs from the pole attachment rate formulas so that pole attachers are not charged multiple times for capital costs. Adopt a formula for computing the maximum pole attachment rate that may be imposed on incumbent local exchange carriers. Proposing the ILECs should be presumptively entitled to pay a pole attachment rate using the telecommunications rate formula. Establish a 180-day shot clock for Commission consideration of pole attachment complaints, and adopt rules that would allow incumbent local exchange carriers to gain non-discriminatory access to poles owned by other local exchange carriers, as at this time ILECs cannot demand access to the poles. There are also additional areas of comment on pole attachments which focus on process. The NPRM seeks comment on types of pole attachment data resources currently available to make more information publicly available regarding rates, location, and availability of poles for faster pole attachment timelines. It also seeks comment on actions that the Commission might be able to undertake to speed development of next-generation networks by facilitating access to infrastructure owned by entities not subject to Section 224. Finally, the NPRM seeks comment on ways to make the process of gaining access to specifically to utility conduits more transparent. The NPRM also seeks comment on ways to reduce the regulatory burdens carriers face when retiring legacy copper facilities, such as providing greater flexibility and expediting the process of retiring copper facilities and making other network changes to enable carriers to transition more rapidly to modern networks. And finally, the NPRM proposes and seeks comment on ways to streamline the Section 214 discontinuance process by expediting the regulatory process by which carriers must obtain FCC authorization and to discontinue legacy service, and seeking comment on a wide variety of additional changes to streamline the discontinuance process to facilitate greater investment in next-generation services for consumers. Moving on to the notice of inquiry. Primarily, the notice of inquiry seeks comment on whether the Commission should enact rules consistent with the Commission's authority under Section 253 of the Act. Generally, Section 253 of the Communications Act addresses barriers to entry and gives the Commission the ability to preempt certain state and local regulations that prohibit the ability of an entity to provide telecommunications service. The first part of the NOI seeks comment on using Section 253 preemption authority to enact rules prohibiting the enforcement of state and local laws that inhibit broadband deployment. More specifically, the item asks about how the Commission might address deployment moratoria, delays in rights-of-way negotiations and approval processes, excessive fees and other costs, unreasonable conditions, and potential bad faith negotiation conduct in the context of permitting, construction, licensing, or granting access to rights of way. The NOI also recognizes that states and localities play a vital role in deployment and addressing the needs of their residents, and seeks comment on actions the Commission can take to collaboratively work with states and localities to remove barriers to broadband. It also seeks comment on how the FCC can best account for states and localities' important roles and the extent to which the FCC should rely upon collaborative processes to remove barriers to broadband deployment before reporting to preemption. One thing I would like to highlight is that the last portion of this section also recognizes the important role of the BDAC and the contributions the BDAC will make in this process. Here's a quote from the latest draft of the item, which states, "The Commission's newly formed BDAC includes members from states and localities, and it has been charged with working to develop model codes for municipalities and states. The BDAC will also consider additional steps that can be taken to remove state and local regulatory barriers." And you'll learn more about what you're doing later today. The second part of the NOI seeks comment on whether the Commission should enact rules consistent with the Commission's authority under Section 253 of the Act to prohibit unreasonable conditions or requirements that might impede the retirement of copper facilities. More specifically, the item seeks comment on whether there are state laws governing the maintenance or retirement of copper facilities that serve as barriers to deploying next-generation technologies and services that the Commission might seek to preempt. The final portion of the wireline infrastructure item is the request for comment, which seeks comment on revisiting the decision in the Commission's 2014 declaratory ruling and subsequent 2015 order on reconsideration that expanded what constitutes a service for purposes of Section 214 discontinuance review. It also requests comment on other Section 214A interpretations of when carriers must ask for Commission permission to alter or discontinue a service. That summarizes all 3 points of the item, the NPRM, NOI, and request for comment. This item should be released later today or sometime shortly. If you have any specific questions of the item, you may contact Michael Ray or Michelle Burlov, staff attorneys in the Wireline Competition Policy Division, and their names appear also at the end of the item. Comments from the public are due 30 days after publication in the Federal Register, and reply comments from the public are due 60 days after publication in the Federal Register. Or if you have any other general questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to working with you all on the BDAC.
Thank you, Deborah. We'll now ask Paul, our Deputy DFO, Paul Dari, to give us an overview of the wireless infrastructure item.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to mention that in addition to being the Deputy DFO, I'm also an attorney in the Wireless Bureau's Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division. And one of CIPD's primary responsibilities is to concerns broadband infrastructure. And we have an outstanding interdisciplinary team that addresses wireless infrastructure issues with expertise on Section 332, 253, as well as NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. So I'm going to cover the wireless infrastructure notice of proposed rulemaking and notice of inquiry that the Commission adopted yesterday, and it also is being released today if it hasn't already been released. Oops. So at the Commission's meeting yesterday, the Chairman talked about the transition from 4G to 5G and the anticipated changes in network architecture. He said the future of wireless will evolve from large macro cell towers to include thousands of densely deployed small cells operating at lower power. And he expressed concern about the challenges wireless providers face in their efforts to deploy this new infrastructure and the need to update the Commission's environmental and historic preservation rules, as well as the review processes at the state and local level. So the wireless infrastructure NPRM and NOI seek comment on actions the Commission could take to expedite wireless infrastructure deployments by exploring ways to improve state and local governments' review processes for siting applications, and it seeks comment on potential revisions to the Commission's rules and processes implementing its responsibilities under the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. So this is just an outline of most of what I'm going to be covering. The notice of proposed rulemaking first focuses on state and local review processes by seeking comment on deemed granted remedy for missing a shot clock deadline, shorter shot clock moratoria, and then with regard to environmental and historic preservation, the NPRM seeks comment on tribal fees, Section 106 exclusions, non-compliant towers, NEPA streamlining, and the scope of federal action and undertaking. So the Commission seeks comment on whether to adopt a deemed granted remedy if a state or local government fails to act upon a siting application within a reasonable period of time under Section 332, which effectively means by the applicable shot clock deadline. Currently, the shot clock deadline is a rebuttable presumption under Section 332, and the remedy for a missed deadline is through litigation. But with a deemed granted rule, failure to act would, by the deadline, would result in a more automatic remedy of granting the application. So something's, I didn't even touch this. Okay, so now I'm on the shot clock. Has this been going on the whole time?
It just started.
Okay. All right. All right. So the Commission also seeks comment in the NPRM on shortening the shot clock for the purpose of determining a reasonable period of time under Section 332. The current shot clock is 90 days for localities to review and act upon co-locations, and 150 days for other types of applications. And so the NPRM seeks comment on whether it should create different shot clocks for more narrowly defined classes of deployment, and comment is sought on whether these distinctions should be based on such factors as the size of the equipment, the location of the deployment, or whether an applicant may be seeking approval for multiple sites at one time. The NPRM seeks comment on, what did I do anything wrong here? Okay. So it seeks comment on moratoria. It seeks comment on whether some localities are continuing to impose moratoria or other restrictions on the filing or processing of applications, including refusing to accept applications or insisting that applicants agree to tolling arrangements. And the Commission proposes to take any actions necessary, such as issuing an order or a declaratory ruling to provide more specific clarifications of the moratorium ban or to preempt specific state or local moratoria. So turning now to the Commission's responsibilities under the National Historic Preservation Act. The NPRM seeks comment on tribal fees. In particular, it seeks comment on proposals for determining when applicants may be required to compensate tribal nations for their role in reviewing wireless infrastructure deployments. It seeks comment on the amount of compensation sought by some tribal nations and the possible legal framework for the Commission to potentially establish a fee schedule or to resolve disputes. It also addresses a tribal nation's area of geographic interest off tribal lands. Many tribal nations have increased their areas of interest in recent years within the Commission's tower construction notification system, and this has resulted in an increase in the number of tribal nations that applicants are required to contact prior to constructing their facilities. And the Commission seeks comment on actions it can take to mitigate the impact of this development while complying with its obligations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The NPRM also seeks comment on additional exclusions from historic preservation review process by seeking comment on excluding co-locations in transportation rights of way, excluding co-locations that are near historic districts, provided that they are at least 50 feet from the boundary, excluding co-locations reviewed and approved by a certified local government, and excluding co-locations that have been approved with a certificate of appropriateness from a local historic preservation review body. So this item also seeks comment on streamlining the Commission's environmental review process under NEPA. In particular, it seeks comment on whether the Commission's rules should be revised to, subject to certain conditions, provide that an environmental assessment is not required for siting in a floodplain. And it also seeks comment on whether it should adopt a categorical exclusion for Dawson small cell facilities subject to certain conditions. Okay, so looking more at the big picture with regard to the NEPA and the historic preservation process, the Commission seeks comment on whether it should revisit the current interpretation of the scope of its responsibilities to review wireless facility deployments under both NEPA and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. It requests comment on the current interpretation of major federal action and a federal undertaking under both NEPA and the NHPA, and whether it should be changed. Whether it should be changed in light of developments in wireless infrastructure technology, the move from site-by-site licensing to geographic area licensing of wireless services, and other factors. And the item seeks comment on a definitive solution for the so-called Twilight Towers. These are towers that were built between the adoption of the co-location agreement in 2001 and the nationwide programmatic agreement in 2005. These are cases in which these towers may not have completed the Section 106 review process. The Commission is seeking comment on a solution that will allow Twilight Towers to be used for co-locations subject to certain conditions while also respecting the integrity of the Section 106 process. And it also seeks comment on what actions it can take to facilitate co-locations on other non-compliant towers constructed after March 7th, 2005. Okay, so finally on to the notice of inquiry. The NOI examines the interplay between Section 253 and 332 and seeks comment on a number of issues associated with the local review process. It invites commenters to present views on interpretations of Section 332 and 253 in determining state or local regulations that may prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting service. It seeks comment on the extent of unreasonable discrimination in state or local review or wireless siting applications relative to other siting applications. The NOI seeks comment on fees as well. I should note that WTB's streamlining public notice released in December sought comment on fees for use of rights of way. The NOI seeks comment on application fees or other charges for siting wireless infrastructure on properties beyond rights-of-way. In particular, it seeks comment on whether upfront fees, recurring charges, or other practices may be inconsistent with the Communications Act. And finally, I should say that the Commission seeks comment on whether it should provide any new or updated guidance or determinations pursuant to its authority under these statutes, including through the issuance of a declaratory ruling. So just as similar to the Wireline item, the comments are due 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. Reply comments are due 60 days after publication in the Federal Register. And so I just want to say that I look forward to working with all of you. If you have any questions on this item or any other FCC-related wireless infrastructure issue, please don't hesitate to ask me. And if I can't give a good answer, as I mentioned, we have a team of experts in the Wireless Bureau, and I can direct you to someone else who could help you. So, thank you.
At this time, we can take a few minutes for any committee member questions for Deborah or Paul. Great. Okay. I'm sure that you're not off the hook. Those will come later.
Actually, Paul, I have a question for you. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
You knew it was coming. When you talk about moving from site-by-site review, how do we move towards moving from site-by-site review to network review? So when you think about the topology of how 5G networks are going to be built, and you think about the movement from today we're about 90,000 outdoor nodes, and we're going to 380,000 outdoor nodes in the next 5 years, how do you deal with that, and how can we convince municipalities to look at the totality of the network instead of getting into a knife fight pole by pole?
Right. So you're asking that question not in the context of NEPA or the National Historic Preservation Act and what is an undertaking or major
Actually,
federal
I'm
action.
asking it in both ways. Because
Okay.
if you think about it, for example, if you're building a network, pick a city like, well, for example, like the District of Columbia, which is really not a city, but a bad example, or San Francisco. If you're going to locate 300 nodes inside the city limits of San Francisco, and notice I'm not picking on San Jose, and you think about how many state historic preservation buildings exist in San Francisco, you literally have to get SHPO on every single pole when you're deploying a broadband network inside of those city limits. But yet, you're trying to build a network that will serve the entire general population. And so how do we deal with that as we move, as you said, moving from site by site, where you're starting to deploy networks, as we move away from thinking in the classic, I have a search ring, I build a site, it covers, 1,200 POPs, to I got to build 30 nodes within a geographic area that's going to support 5 macro sites and support 30,000 people. How do we change the thinking?
Okay, so if you look at your question more globally, I think that's one of the things that this committee could look at. One of the working groups that is looking at batching, addressing multiple sites at one time. With regard to the Commission seeking comment on the scope of its authority under NEPA and Section 106, I think your question falls within the scope of what the Commission is seeking comment on. I was just giving the move from site by site to geographic area licensing is just an example of the factors the Commission is looking at.
And then as a second point to that, should we also be thinking about poles where we have co-location? So if you think about that for a second, if you have an existing node, right, in an existing location, and another carrier wants to co-locate on that node, you'd almost have to go back de novo in certain municipalities. Where if you think about what we were able to do in sort of 4G deployments with co-location by right, shouldn't we have that same standard applied for small cells and pole attachments?
That's a good question. I don't think I'm authorized to say anything more than that.
I'm trying to provoke a discussion around this because I think that's important.
Somebody else wants to.
We want to encourage, multiple uses on the same poles. And so if we could do that, and we have poles where we have multiple carriers on the same pole. And the question is, how do we apply the same methodology of co-location by right into sort of small cell by right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. And I one of the things that I think this committee should be looking at.
Sounds like some great discussion points for our committee work, Mark. And thank you for getting everybody thinking about them. I'm going to cut us off there, though, for now, and we'll come back to it. Promise. I'll be right there with you. Yeah. At this time, I'm going to move us along to a presentation from Paula Silberthau from the FCC General Counsel's Office, and she's going to give us an overview of the Federal Advisory Committee Act and how it relates to this BEAD Act, and more of our foundational setup so that this committee can get to work on all these important issues.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for being here. My purpose is to try to give you some of the background of the Advisory Committee Act and some of the key rules so that the good ideas that you come up with can actually, if the Commission likes them, be implemented and they can rely on it. Because the one pitfall is if we stray too far from what the Federal Advisory Committee Act says, then people can challenge things and then your reports and recommendations can't be used. So that's my excuse for what may be a little bit boring in going through some of the rules. So you operate under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. It's a statute. It's pretty general in its principles. And it tries to promote openness in government so that people can attend the meetings, people sitting at the back. Diversity and balance in membership. It can't be stacked. And public accountability. You can't just have a meeting and not announce it. It has to be announced 15 days in advance. And under the old-fashioned format, which still exists here, it has to be put into the Federal Register. So there has to be advanced planning. If the chair or anyone else decides that there's something really important and you really need an emergency meeting or you need to vote on something or have your voices heard before the Commission acts on something, something like that happens, get in touch with your designated federal officer, Brian, or with Paul, and they can try to work with you on scheduling a meeting, but it's just not something we can turn around on a dime because of the constraints under the Advisory Committee Act. Meetings meetings of the full parent committee, which you all are members of, are required to be open. But I just wanted you to be aware that they can be closed under certain circumstances, and I don't think, from what I know, that those circumstances would arise here. But if you think any of these following things are implicated, let Brian or Paul know. That would be trade secrets, classified government materials, something pertaining to national security. Presumably, if this has happened before over the past couple of years, if people are talking candidly about problems with their network and vulnerabilities and, charts, things like that show just what you wouldn't want the rest of the world to know about, we would close, there are procedures, we would close the meeting if this were something that were really essential to what you were doing. So I just raise that. Under FACA, the Commission is required to keep copies of all reports, of all minutes of meetings, records of members who are present at the meeting, all documents you receive, and really all internal communications between all of you or anyone else who's on the working groups. So as a result of that, it's important that your DFOs, Brian and Paul, be included on sort of all official emails that you might have. So, for example, if you're working on a draft report and the head of the working group or the whatever group is working on it decides that it's really a good thing to try to get some edits from members, which happens all the time, please be sure to, this is part of the official record, so please, include the FCC staff, not me, on those communications so we can fulfill our duties and keep appropriate records. To the most important people are the designated federal officer, and the duty of the DFO is to call the meetings, approve the agendas, and that typically includes the agendas of the working groups because your working groups handle a lot of really important matters. Opening and closing the meetings, maintaining the committee records, which I just mentioned, and making sure there are minutes taken of at least of the parent committee meetings. And your chair is also extremely important, and the chair will serve as your focal point if you have questions as well. And the chair works with Brian and Paul in setting up the working groups. So all of those people, all of these three people can be, sort of center for your communications and questions. I'd like to take a second to go through the distinction between your informal working groups and the full group, because just as the full group needs to be announced in advance and have records and minutes of meeting, and has to be open except for trade secrets, the working groups are sort of the worker bees here and gather the information, and under the GSA regs and under practice across the government, the working group meetings are the opposite. They're pretty much closed. And that's because you're not making proposals to the FCC. You're really doing the hard work of gathering information and making some preliminary recommendations. So the working groups can get the information together, develop plans, come up with reports and recommendations and findings. And this is typically in meetings closed to the public, although if you have two working groups together that are sort of touching on the same thing, other members of the full committee could attend and listen to the meetings of, co-working groups. The thing that's very important here is that because those working groups are closed, the recommendations do not go from the working groups to the full committee, because then the working group would be acting like it was the parent committee. So the working groups just make the recommendations. The working groups are always less than a quorum, and the working groups make their recommendations or submit their reports to all of you. And then those working group recommendations and reports would be subject to full debate, questions, modifications at a meeting of the full committee. And that's just really important. I mean, they're not supposed to be rubber stamped. Everyone at the full committee should feel free to fully understand and question why the working group recommendations are what they are, and to make proposals for recommendations for changes if you have them. So it's like, it's a multi-step process there. One other question that sometimes happens is, well, what if the working group really needs an outside advisor to come in because maybe all of us are not, fully knowledgeable about all the ins and outs of the things we have to cover? And that's fine. You can ask a particular expert or someone with a strong interest maybe that's not even on that particular group due to size limitations. You can have people come in and they can give presentations. You can ask them questions. There can be a give and take. But then those outside experts or interest groups once the presentation is done, should be graciously asked to leave so that you can resume your deliberations. But if you find that there's just an area that you'd like to know more about, it's absolutely fine, and it's pretty common to invite other people in for a session or two. It's just that they can't be invited repeatedly, because then somehow they're sort of functioning like like a full member. So usually we say once or maybe even twice, but not 10 times, because then they're members. Other things that come up, yes, we issued, correct, the public notice on the ex partes, which is probably on your website. But essentially, a lot of times, as we could see today, you're working on hot topics, and they're the subject of pending NPRMs. There might even be NPRMs that rulemakings that come into existence after you start that we don't even know about now. So for that reason, just as we did, the agency often issues this ex parte sort of exemption notice. So the ex parte rule basically says any person or entity, if they're going to be communicating to agency decision makers about matters that are before the commission in dockets, they have to submit you'd have to submit some sort of writing to the agency that goes into the docket that explains what the substance of your presentation. Since that would sort of be a little bit burdensome in a proceeding like this, where you'll necessarily be getting into that, and you'll be discussing things in the working groups and maybe even with the commissioners from time to time, this notice says basically that when you're discussing BDAC matters with agency decision makers, whether it's staff or the commissioners themselves, you're exempt from the ex parte rules. But if later on it turns out that the agency wants to rely on the communications that you've made, agency staff will put those communications on the record so that ultimately nothing is secret, and if people don't like your communications also, they can respond to it. But that's just one little thing you now don't have to worry about too much. The other thing I want to mention is the Paperwork Reduction Act, which some of you may have heard about, which prevents agencies from basically, I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand it, basically sending out surveys or record collections to 10 or more people on a particular subject. Sometimes our advisory groups or particularly our working groups would like to send out surveys on something. Or if not a full survey, to a dozen people. And the problem is that when our working groups take action and when you guys take action, it's to some extent an action of the agency. So the answer is you can't do surveys, in the sort of classic sense to get information. If for any reason there's something that you felt it was really important for the agency to get a survey on, you could make a recommendation to Brian or Paul and say, in the future it'd really be helpful for us to have this information or for you guys, and they could take it into account. But then you have to start the Paperwork Reduction Act process, which involves getting OMB approval, and it takes a couple of months. So it's really not something that fits in well with your format because you're operating under a more expedited time frame. On the other hand, if you do feel you want some outside sort of generic input on something that's more like a notice of inquiry, or you might want to just get some general comments from companies, states, localities on a certain issue to sort of supplement your own knowledge, get in touch with the DFOs, and it might be possible, working with the working groups, to put something that's not a survey with detailed questions, but that's sort of a much more general statement on the website. And again, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that that can sometimes happen. It wouldn't be detailed questions, but you could say, we'd like input from such and such groups on this subject. That's rare, but I think it has been done before with some advisory committees. But please, and by the way, this is not to say that if you know that there's one interest group or one state or one or two companies, they're trying something new and innovative, or that have run into a particular problem, on an individual basis, yes, it would be okay, and especially if they're your friends, you can reach out to them and you can ask them questions and you can get input. I'm trying to distinguish that from a broad-based request for information. Let's see. The final thing I'd mention is that occasionally there's been confusion when people are asked to speak or volunteer to speak on matters that an advisory group is addressing, because sometimes people have very strong views on the issue. And one thing I would like to say is, if you're speaking on something about that's before the advisory group and you want to identify yourself and as an advisory group member or as the chair of a working group or as whatever, the chair of the full committee, that's fine as long as you make clear that any substantive views that you're giving are your own, they're your individual views, and that you're not speaking for the full committee. So it's fine to say, speaking for the committee, I'm a member of the committee, we have so many members, and these are the things we're addressing. But when you get into the substance of what the recommendations should be or what your views are on something, it's just real important to make sure that it's clear that they're individual views. And we ran into a situation where there was, about 3 years back, where there was a very, very contentious issue, and the chair of a working group ended up being in the minority when a vote was taken on a report, and accepted that graciously, except that the person then submitted an article to a journal or a paper giving all the reasons, which was fine individually, all the reasons why the working group's recommendation, which then was public, was wrong. And that was fine, except that the individual then signed it, Paula Silberthal, chair of the working group. So it was very confusing because it made it seem as though somehow the working group had actually taken the contrary position. I don't think it was intentional, but and then people got all sorts of phone calls, were confused, what's the position of the working group, are we supposed to disregard this report? So based on that, I've added this little disclaimer to this presentation just to make you aware of that. But it's not to try to shut down your ability to participate in meetings and give your own views on things. So I think that's it. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. If you do have questions as we go along on, how to do things or procedural aspects, feel free to let Brian or Paul know, and they'll get in touch with me, and hopefully we can answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. We're going to take a brief break now. We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes, so at 10 to 12. Sorry, I'm 4 time zones off. At 11:50. Thank you. We're going to reconvene. Please take your seats. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Brian Hurley, our designated federal officer, who's going to give us an overview of our BDAC process, agenda, some other factors that we need, and then from there we'll move into some committee discussion, and we'll be able to get back to some of Mark's comments.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As mentioned, I'm Brian Hurley, designated federal officer for the BDAC. This is the final presentation of the morning, so thank you for bearing with us so far. So I'm just going to give kind of an overview of the BDAC and kind of like what to expect going forward in the coming weeks and months as we start to get the BDAC really up and running. So what is the BDAC? It's a federal advisory committee chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Paula Silberthau in her presentation gave kind of laid out kind of what that means in terms of our process and the requirements we have to follow. Members have been selected to balance expertise and the viewpoints relevant to these issues that we'll be considering, and I think just looking around the table, I think it's clear that we've achieved that. A very diverse and balanced group with a lot of diverse perspectives represented. The BDAC was officially established on March 1st, 2017. The charter runs for 2 years, so it will expire on March 1st, 2019, although the FCC does have the option of seeking to renew the charter for another 2-year period. So what is the BDAC's mission? Kind of in a nutshell, it's this first bullet: to make recommendations to the Commission on how to accelerate the deployment of high-speed internet access, or broadband, by reducing and/or removing regulatory barriers to infrastructure investment. So that's kind of it, kind of putting a fine point on it. And BDAC is intended to be sort of a forum for stakeholders with diverse interests to exchange ideas and develop recommendations on broadband deployment, and ultimately your work will assist the Commission in carrying out its statutory responsibilities.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
People can see it better now.
Oh, thank you.
But
So,
you're on the wrong slide.
no, this is good.
Okay.
Yeah, so the point there was the BDAC, your work, ultimately it's helping the Commission carrying out its duties, in particular our responsibility to encourage broadband deployment to all Americans. So this next slide may be of particular interest to those around the table. This is laying out sort of a timeline of what to expect for 2017, and I'll just kind of run through this. April 21st, that's today, the inaugural meeting. Nice to see everyone. In May is when, next few weeks or so, it's when we're going to try to start getting these working groups up and running. We've been working through the process of considering and selecting members for those groups. There will be some individuals who are not around this table, but who applied for the BDAC and also have good perspectives to bring, who will be part of those working groups. So then once the working groups get up and running, during sort of the May to July timeframe, first few months, you'll sort of begin your initial work on recommendations. And then July 20th, this is a date people should probably put in their calendars, is what at least tentatively, I think we'll try to hold this date, but this is what we're thinking as the next of these in-person BDAC meetings here in Washington, here at FCC headquarters. And this July 20th meeting, it would be sort of a midterm meeting where the working groups would have the opportunity to present and discuss sort of what progress they've made to date on developing recommendations, maybe any challenges they face. And the full committee would then have an opportunity to discuss, all of the different groups' presentations and provide input, troubleshoot. It's an opportunity for the full group to kind of deliberate on the work that's been done so far. And so following that meeting, the working groups will then go back and continue to do their work over the next few months, from July until sort of the October, November timeframe. That's when the working groups will continue to develop and ultimately finalize their recommendations to the BDAC. You could also sort of think of these as the preliminary recommendations of the BDAC, since the working group doesn't directly advise the Commission. It goes up to the BDAC, and then the BDAC deliberates and votes. So that process will play out, and then sometime in the October to November timeframe, we haven't set a date yet. we're planning to have a sort of the end of the year BDAC meeting. And this will really be the meeting where every working group will present their recommendations to the full BDAC, and then the full BDAC will then have the opportunity to deliberate, to provide input, to suggest modifications or amendments, and ultimately there will be a final vote, and by the members of the BDAC, the people around this table, and whatever recommendations the BDAC votes to approve, then those are the recommendations of the BDAC, and then those will go to the commission. There'll be the BDAC's recommendations to the commission. So just a little bit of overview on the working groups and that process. The working groups are just crucially important to the success of this whole BDAC endeavor. The actual in-person meetings like these are relatively few and far between. They're about quarterly or so. So in order for these meetings to be successful and for there to be good fodder for discussion and debate, then a lot of work needs to be done in the interim in the working groups. I think Paula used the term the worker bees. That's kind of a good analogy for the working group process. So to make that happen, each working group should be planning to meet frequently, at least once a week. It'll probably be a good idea for each working group to set up a standing weekly meeting. And as Paula mentioned, the working group meetings, unlike these full BDAC meetings, which are public and in person in Washington, the working group meetings will be closed and they'll meet via teleconference. And Paul and I and others on the staff, we can certainly assist in getting the conferences set up. So each member of this group of the BDAC will be assigned to one or two of the working groups, and I'll just sort of say now, we're still in the process of selecting the full membership of these groups, and we want to make sure that the expertise around this table is sort of well balanced among the groups, and there's a good mix of viewpoints and expertise and perspectives and disciplines in all the groups. So at this point, we're not ready to assign members of the group to particular working groups, but we're expecting that to be accomplished soon, and certainly once we actually start getting the working groups up and running, you'll certainly know by that point. And as I mentioned before, and we mentioned this in our public notice we released when we announced the membership, each working group will include not only members of the BDAC, but also other individuals who applied to serve on the BDAC were not selected. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to give some additional detail on the assignments for the five working groups. These are the five working groups that we're setting up for the BDAC. We announced these on April 6th in our public notice. They haven't changed. But before I go into that, though, I just want to preface this a little bit. First of all, these the descriptions that will follow and the slides, these may continue to be refined a little bit as we move forward. But as you'll see, each working group is being instructed to develop recommendations in particular areas. But ultimately, it's up to you guys, up to the BDAC, to determine what the recommendations are. So we sort of set the parameters in which you operate, and then you ultimately will tell us what you recommend. And I'll give a practical example of how this might play out. So we're going to have two working groups tasked with developing model codes, one for municipalities and one for states. In the next few slides, we suggest some of the topics that each of these codes might cover, but ultimately it will be up to the BDAC to decide the contents of both codes, including which issues are covered in each code. Essentially, I mean, you're the experts, so we're leaving it to you to recommend what's best. And as we go forward, Paul and I, others on our staff, we'll be working closely with our chair and vice chair, Elizabeth and Kelly, also with the chairs and vice chairs of the different working groups to coordinate the work flows and taskings across the different groups, just to make sure all the groups are kind of working harmoniously. So I'll go ahead and move to some descriptions of the individual groups. So first, the working group for the Model Code for Municipalities working group. As we announced, the chair of this group will be Doug Dimitroff, representing the New York State Wireless Association. The vice chair, Mayor Sam Licardo, Mayor of San Jose, California. And the task for this group will be to draft a model code for municipalities to accelerate broadband deployment. And the code, we think it should include model provisions or guidelines related to issues such as franchising, zoning and permitting, dig once policies. The code may also address other aspects of broadband deployment that involve municipal governments. And the code should be designed to meet the needs of municipalities that differ in terms of their size and geography, where they're located, population density. Different municipalities have different kind of background, operate in different background regulatory environments, so that should also be taken into account. Just sort of, the code should be designed to meet a diversity of needs among municipalities. And then the 2017 deliverable is present a municipal model code for a vote at that third BDAC meeting in the October-November timeframe. Moving on to the second group, the Model Code for States. The chair of this group will be Kelly McGriff, Southern Light, and the vice chair will be Commissioner Karen Charles Peterson, the Massachusetts Department of Telecom and Cable, representing NARUC on this committee. And this is pretty analogous to the first group. Their task will be to draft a model code for state governments to accelerate broadband deployment. And we think this code cover issues such as franchising at the state level, as well as the role of state regulatory agencies or state broadband councils, other bodies, what role they can play in deployment. Another facet we think this code could cover is state government efforts to promote more robust deployment at the municipal level. Things like certification programs or grant programs, things like that, as well as any other aspects of deployment that involve states. And again, the code should be sort of designed to meet the needs of a variety of states. And again, the goal is to have this committee present a state model code for a vote at that third meeting. So the third group is this competitive access to broadband infrastructure group. The chair will be Ken Simon, and the vice chair sitting next to him will be Brent Skorup, or Ken Simon of Crown Castle, I should say, and Brent Skorup of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And here are just some of the areas where we think this group could develop recommendations. First, on measures to promote speedier, more efficient, competitive access to utility poles while ensuring the safety and integrity of existing attachments. And this is an area where they could look at things like one touch make ready, right touch make ready, other pole attachment policies. Examine and develop recommendations on measures to promote competitive access to other infrastructure, not just poles, but also ducts, conduits, rights-of-way. And then another area we think this group could examine is on steps to improve the transparency of information regarding the availability of infrastructure, sort of locating the where poles are located and how to get access to them, that sort of thing. And ultimately, this group would then present recommendations at the meeting, the October-November meeting. And for this group and the two that follow, those there's not a particular concrete output, like a model code, but it's recommendations, within these broad parameters and possibly recommendations for further study if the group wants to dig in deeper on some of these issues. So the fourth working group is removing state and local regulatory barriers. So the chair of that group will be Bob Dubrow of TDS Telecom, and the vice chair will be Kim Keenan, MMTC. And here are some of the areas we think this group could look at. Identifying patterns of specific instances of actions at the state and local level that serve as or potentially serve as barriers to deployment. and providing recommendations on how to address those. Identifying examples and looking at the consequences of local government restrictions that may prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting service. I think that's from Section 332 that we're quoting there, right?
And 253.
And 253. Such as by things like by requiring the undergrounding of wireless facilities, and then recommending solutions to address those issues. And then another issue is examining the extent to which some municipalities may single out communications-related deployments for more burdensome regulatory treatment than other types of deployments, and making recommendations for addressing disparate outcomes of that kind. And again, presenting recommendations at the third meeting is ultimately the goal here. And then last but not least, the working group on streamlining federal siting. The chair of this group, Jonathan Edelstein of the Wireless Infrastructure Association. And the vice chair of this group will be Valerie Fasthorse of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And here we've suggested a number of areas in which the group could develop recommendations to improve the process of siting on federal lands and on federally managed properties. Such as by recommending standard procedures for facility siting and looking at standardizing durations of leases and easements, considering whether to recommend a shot clock for the processing of applications for facility siting on federal land by federal agencies, exploring and reporting on possible methods for federal agencies themselves to identify and report on coverage gaps and deficiencies. And finally, recommending procedures for creating and maintaining some sort of publicly accessible inventory of space that could be used to attach or to install broadband infrastructure. And once again, the goal is to have the group present some recommendations for a vote at that third meeting. So that concludes my presentation. As we've said before, I'm very, very excited to be working with all of you, and look forward to getting the BDAC really up and running. So I'll turn things back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, now the fun stuff. Ready, Mark? I'm going to ask the committee members to share with us their interest in the BDAC and what they hope to see as outcome from this effort. I know some of our committee members need to slip out a little bit before our planned 1 o'clock adjournment. So we're probably going to go out of order a little to give everyone the opportunity to speak. If you need to leave a little early because you have other commitments, just when we get started, give me a show of hands, and we'll make sure everyone gets an opportunity to speak. I think Kelly and I will lead off with our perspectives. I just completed phase 1 of a very complex fiber optic cable system deployment in remote Alaska, and it's remote by standards that a lot of people don't even understand. And I was constantly struck by the fact that it took us twice as long to permit the project as it did to build the cable from scratch, ship it from France through the Panama Canal, sail in a fleet of 14 vessels, and install the system. And that it took 13% of my capital budget just to get through the permitting processes. So I was definitely highly motivated when I saw this opportunity present itself. And I think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to pick in terms of the challenges that we face deploying broadband and managing the economics of deploying broadband, especially in remote and rural areas. I'm also struck by the need for broadband. I was at South by Southwest and was stunned to learn from Oracle and Dell that there are 5.4 million unfilled tech jobs, and that broadband deployment gives that industry access to talent by being able to engage remote workers. And so we don't just have a business need, we have a national economic need to ensure that we deploy broadband effectively and efficiently. So I look forward to us very aggressively and effectively promoting some recommendations to Chairman Pai that will help to achieve that mission. Kelly.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm very grateful to the FCC and Chairman Pai for convening this group, and I'm very excited to work with our chair on these issues. I just want to speak a little bit from my perspective working for the state of Utah. For the past 6 years, I've worked as the head of the Broadband initiative in Utah, and as such, this issue is something that I care about deeply, both for residents being able to get the services that they need, for businesses to be able to grow without being hindered by the services that they're offered. And as somebody that takes a lot of phone calls on a state level, both from residents that have hard issues getting connected, but also from businesses that would like to serve areas and that are trying to figure out how to do that, I think that there is good intent on both sides. And in the last several years, one of the things that we've done in Utah is convened a very similar group of private sector companies as well as state groups. And so I've been able to see similar conversations and the power of getting a lot of talent and intellect in a room with people that are on the ground deploying networks, and to get that feedback will be very significant in coming up with some very tactical ways to improve services. And I'm excited about the roster of people that's agreed to serve on this committee and also on the subgroups. And I'm very excited to see the recommendations that come forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to ask Kim to go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm just so happy to be here because you're right, it's an opportunity for us to make something happen. I'm so excited. I've talked to some people in the room today, and we have the will and the mind power to get this done, and I think that it is a win-win if we connect everyone, if we make it easy for people to connect everyone, because there are jobs in the balance for Americans. There are jobs that we need to be able to fulfill, and if we reach people, then they will be able to have those opportunities. So it's not just about those jobs, it's about the small businesses that will be able to leverage having broadband. So I just think this is an exciting opportunity. We have all the mind power we need to make this happen, and I'm just excited to be a part of that team.
Thank you, Kim. Are there any of the other committee members that need to be able to leave a little bit early that would like to speak now? Okay. Any volunteers to speak next?
Well, I'm excited also. I have been working mostly on the federal regulatory side, and I think a lot of the major hurdles for universal service, for getting capital to help deploy, have really sort of come through in what the FCC has done in terms of revising universal service. And this is the next step, really. A step that I wasn't intimately familiar with, never being in the office because I'm always traveling, but I've already put together a couple of groups within TDS Telecom, and the stories I've already heard and the information that we've got and the information that we will be able to gather, through other people in the room, I think is going to be, we're going to be able to make a tremendous move forward in being able to get stuff out faster, being able to take some of the costs out of the system of doing this. We've had grants in states that we have been hung up in terms of being able to spend the money for over 2 years because of permitting issues. And when I hear that kind of stuff, it's like, wow, there's got to be a way to fix this. And so I'm looking forward to this group getting together and really digging in and kind of figuring out a way to make it easier to deploy broadband, yet keeping in mind what Commissioner Clyburn said. Don't just go through and basically
rip out all the restrictions, because what are restrictions for some are, lifesavers for others. So you really have to take a balanced approach and really look at this stuff. And so I think it's going to be an interesting and not a real easy task, but an interesting one, and one that's absolutely necessary.
Thank you.
He makes a really good point. I think it's an important point you make, because the last significant major broadband deployment that we underwent was the movement from 3G to 4G. And the case studies that we have there from a lot of the major mobile operators around some of the legislation that we got approved at PCIA when we went to the Hill and got that bill done actually led to significant savings for the carriers. And it was one of the few bills that we got everyone on the same page. We went to the Hill, we got it done, and we were actually able to quantify the savings to the carriers, which ultimately is savings to the consumer when you translate that. And also we were able to reduce cycle time, which is a killer for OEMs. And it's a killer for deployment teams and for people that are boots on the ground that are actually replacing base stations, replacing radios. And the key fundamental driver of that success was co-location. And we have a really big challenge, I think, as a committee, Chair Pierce, which is to define what is new co-location. And what does co-location look like in a 5G world? And I think that's a big definitional change, because we've all talked about, I've heard a lot of people today talk about the topology and the changes in what networks look like in the future. What does MIMO really mean? Can we deliver the promise of broadband? But we first have to define how to deploy this technology and to put as much of it under one umbrella called co-location as possible, because it's something that people fundamentally understand, which is the shared infrastructure model. And shared infrastructure means lower cost. And the more that we can share infrastructure, it's just a much easier story to sell than saying we've got a whole bunch of technology and we're going to deploy hundreds of thousands of new locations. Well, actually, yeah, we're going to deploy hundreds of thousands of new locations, but it's going to ride on a lot of existing infrastructure. And how do we tell that story? How do we tell the story of new co-location? And what does it really mean? Back to what Paul was saying earlier, is this a site-by-site argument or a site-by-site debate that we're going to have? Or do we debate that really it's about, not so much about rulemaking around sites, but it's rulemaking around networks? And that's, I think, a challenge for all of us to think about. And I don't have an answer for it, but I want to put it out there that I think the concept of co-location has changed. And I think if we can present that in a light that is very friendly to all constituents, and we can make the case that it improves cost and it improves consumer benefit, I think we'll be wildly successful. That's just my view of the universe, for what it's worth.
Thank you, Mark.
Hi, David Don from Comcast. Thanks for the opportunity to talk for a minute. At Comcast, we are deploying broadband networks throughout the country. We're not just the cable company. Of course, we're in 39 states in the District of Columbia. We spend billions of dollars every year on deploying fiber throughout this country in last miles as well as long haul. And we are in the middle now of a major capital investment in fiber throughout this country, urban areas and rural areas. One of the things I want to make sure we accomplish in this committee, and I know there are other fiber deployment companies here, is that we're not just talking about 5G and wireless, and I know that's a dominant issue, and we're going to play a big role in that at Comcast too. We provide backhaul for all of that, and who knows, one day there's always rumors about what we'll do on the other end of that, but it's primarily, we look at that as a great opportunity. But right now we're looking at major obstacles at local levels and other levels when permitting and things like that are related to fiber build out. So we want to make sure there's a healthy discussion around fiber to the home, wireline, and all of the broadband services to the home, and all of the infrastructure we need to build that out as well. At the same time, we've been building these networks for the better part of 40 years, and we understand the role that local communities play. And as Commissioner Clyburn mentioned, permitting is a legitimate function of the local governments, and we need to work with them to educate them on the importance of broadband. They want broadband in their communities too. There's no doubt about that. We see that in our conversations with them every day. But there are efforts and things like the model code hopefully will accomplish in streamlining. So we're looking for balanced discussion that includes wireline as well as wireless. and an understanding, I think, of the role that the elected local officials play in protecting their interests as well as promoting broadband deployment.
Thank you, David. Jeffrey?
One quick comment on what Mark said. I'm not necessarily in any way opposed to co-location. It may very well be the right answer, but it does sound like an answer before we've actually asked the right questions. And I would at least want to make sure that before we jump into this with singing, that we are mindful of things like property rights and appropriate mechanisms for exchange and determining prices. The problem with a co-location above all else approach is that it sounds an awful lot like mandated access, and that inherently creates a whole host of problems. It may be the right thing. I just want to point out that it also may not be the right thing exactly in every situation.
And you're advocating that we apply process before decision.
Exactly.
Thank you. You can volunteer. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I very much wanted to serve on this committee because I believe that it's a fundamental right for all Americans to have access to broadband. And I think it's absolutely critical for rural America to have the same access to broadband, as much as that's possible to do as you have in urban areas. And that includes multiple choices from multiple competitors and not just a single option because there's nothing better that's available in that industry. Arkansas is an extremely rural state. We have a lot of people who have no access to broadband except possibly over cellular, and that has a lot of expense attached to it in terms of bandwidth caps. So I'm hoping as this committee goes forward that we have discussions that are technology agnostic. I take your point about, talking about wireless versus fiber, but I want to say wireless is not a monolithic thing either. You have cellular wireless, you have fixed wireless, and I think we have to take an agnostic position as this committee and look at what we're trying to accomplish. What are the ends? What do we want rural America to have at the end? And then make sure that whatever mechanisms need to be in place, the right technology for the right circumstance can meet their needs. So I'm really looking forward to the work of this committee. I'm very excited about it, and I'm looking forward to what comes out of the working groups.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Michael?
Hello? I'll just talk loud. I think everybody here is on the same playing field. We have very similar goals, and that is to advance the deployment, to get it out to where it's needed. And the reasons, well, I'd like to echo some of the things I've heard already. Appropriate technology. I mean, he who is good with a hammer thinks everything looks like a nail. And I'm very guilty of that. I think there's another engineer down there that relies on physics also. It's hard for us to see beyond that sometimes. So I don't think there's a one solution that fits all. So we need to have a principle-based structure here. Economic impact, I think we can all recognize that. Just an anecdotal story on that. When we deployed broadband to our school district way back in '96, 4 years later we acquired a regional ISP that did hosting. Now, what I think happened is I think the kids learned how to use the tools, learned how to do web research. They went home, they taught their parents. The parents went to work, and the whole area benefited from that. When we looked at this from this other ISP, it was regional. It was much bigger than our area. 80% of the mom and pop businesses that had websites that had gone global in their marketing were from this one area that had the early deployment in the educational system. Now, there are barriers here, and I hear everybody talking about that. We had two companies that were going to move out of the area because they could not get enough broadband. One did a video show of, it was a hunting show. Their product was turkey calls. But they didn't have enough bandwidth to be able to even FTP to upload their and another one was a company that made camouflage. It was like hillbilly camo or something like that. But when we did the deployment on it, we found that the rules had changed on attachments, and we actually spent more on the engineering fee that we paid a third-party pole inspector than what it cost us for the materials and the labor to build the 100 poles. Something similar to what I think Elizabeth found. So there is a lot of work to do here. I'm just thrilled that the commissioner and the whole environment here is pro making things happen. And I'll commit to do anything I can to help that move forward. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. And I think we have an opportunity here that's really enormous, because we have not just an academic exercise, but we have all of these issues queued up by the FCC. So our input isn't something that's just going to go on a shelf. It can immediately go into a number of NPRMs and proceedings that are petition that's before the Commission now, which is very timely because we have a challenge of historic proportions in front of us. The demand for wireless and wireline broadband data is, as we all know, exploding, and trying to keep up with that is very difficult. There isn't unlimited capital budgets to get it done, and so there's not the ability to spend enormous amounts of resources on getting these networks built besides the actual cost of building them. So removing regulatory drag on that is essential to meeting the demand in a system that's really under some pressure. WI represents the entire ecosystem, from the carriers, the infrastructure owners and builders, and the service companies that are involved. So we deal with these issues daily, and what I find so exciting about this particular body is that it includes states and localities and tribal governments, so that we have the opportunity to hash these things out as a group in a way that we never have. And I heard the word balance, the need for balance that Bob talked about. That's the way we see it. We really want to work with localities. You think about the history of the networks, and we have the world's greatest wireless infrastructure in the United States right now. It was built in partnership with states and localities. Everything that was built, or most everything that was built with a permit and with zoning, and it's created a great system. Mark talked about co-location. You go to overseas and you find you have tower farms where identical infrastructure is next to it. It doesn't look great. It's not economically efficient. And here in the United States, because of the partnership that we've had with states and localities, we have an efficient network that is based on co-location, and it's good on so many different levels. So here we have a chance to work together to find a way where there are stress points, where, for example, in the law that Mark talked about, we used to have to get rezoned to co-locate, which is just ridiculous. And we have a number of examples of that today, but most localities are starting to get it. What we're finding is that increasingly we're finding support for broadband deployment by localities. So what we're trying to do is bring up, I think, all states and localities to the best standards of those that are doing a good job, which is an increasing number. So we have the opportunity here for that dialogue to get done. And I'm thrilled also to be chairing the Federal Lands Working Group. Of course, I was volunteered for that because I've been at it for so long. It's not easy. 3 administrations have fought to get this done, from the Bush administration, the Obama, the Clinton administration before that. And the progress has been extremely limited, despite executive orders on this. Now we have Congress, and both bodies have legislation on it. The administration, again, well, I'm sure will take another run at it. It is a challenge, and we need to do that because it's important for rural America. I hope we can include tribal lands under that as well, because they're not federal lands, they're sovereign nations, and we need to get service to tribal America. I'm looking forward to working with my Vice Chairman, Valerie Fasthorse, to get that done.
Thank you, Jonathan. Alan?
Yes, in my role with Georgia Power for the last 13 years, I've worked directly with pole attachments. We work with a lot of the companies sitting at the table here on a daily basis, some relationships going back 100 years. I've been involved in the activity at the FCC, whether it was the 2007 comments on rules, the National Broadband Plan. We submitted comments and litigated the 2011 order. If I was a college football coach representing the electric utility industry, I'd have been fired a long time ago. But that's not to say I'm here to say no about everything that we see being proposed. We certainly understand we have the rule or have a role in this. We like the concept of one-touch make-ready. Anything that can get the pole freed up and the old pole pulled quicker, we're all for. But I think we also have to remember, just like there's been a lot of discussion about costs, if you're cutting a cost on one side, that same consumer that wants the broadband is also an electric consumer. And so if you've just increased the cost on that individual, have you really achieved your goal? So I look forward to working with the group. I'm glad to have a seat at the table.
Thank you, Alan.
Comment. At Vantage Point, we do work for very small companies and very rural companies. Some of them are less than 0.2 subscribers per square mile, up to, very urban clients. And every situation is so unique. You move from one state to another state, or from the rural area to the urban area, or, even sometimes the size of the company. We just got done trying to help secure financing for one of our clients, a very small rural carrier. And they had spent $700,000 just in environmental, historical preservation kind of things before they could even secure financing to do broadband. And I see time and time again things like that happening where that money could have went a long ways towards actually building the broadband network rather than the preliminary stuff leading up to the broadband network. In Mitchell, South Dakota, which is where our headquarters is, it's a town of 15,000 people. We were a couple years ago awarded the top 7 most intelligent communities in the world, actually. And so I've seen firsthand how the better broadband can make better lives, and we've at Vantage Point are really intent on building out those broadband networks in even the most rural places, just because we know of how much benefit it actually brings to them. And I think it's going to be great to see what outcome the committee has, to see what barriers we can break down to be able to make broadband more available.
Thank you, Larry. Brian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to affirm a couple things that I've heard today. Sorry about that. And first, with Jonathan's comments, certainly agree that our timing is good. There certainly is a critical mass of localities, cities, and counties that just get it. There's sometimes a sense or a portrayal that our communities are against us. I just challenge anybody to point me to a city or a county that says, we don't need better broadband. We're not interested. That cities, counties, they want to figure this out as well. They're searching for the right new processes, new code, new model codes, model ordinances, and so forth. And certainly we see that amongst the cities and counties that we work with. So again, kudos to Chairman Pai for his timing and vision on this. Another comment that I just want to remark on is from Mark about the idea, and this getting in the weeds a bit more perhaps than you want to today, but the idea that we should begin looking at networks versus nodes or networks versus poles. I think that's a great idea, and I note that's a different idea than batching applications of nodes or applications of poles, and I also note that requires a new level of transparency, so it cuts both ways, right? So a new level of transparency that is not here today. And so in order for a city to evaluate a network, they have to receive data about a network that they don't get today. And so I think that opens up an interesting discussion, an interesting path for us to consider how, what are the mechanisms for bringing that data to bear, protecting that data as it needs to be protected, and allowing evaluation of that kind of data. So I look forward to that piece of the discussion going forward particularly. And again, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Brian. John.
So speaking for Sprint, who is building a wireless network, the next generation wireless network, I think the next generation wireless network from now on is going to be built as small cells because of the spectrum we're using and the capacity that you need. We still need towers, but part of the densification of our coverage for our customers is going to be with small cells. So the one thing that's important for companies like Sprint and and other wireless operators is access to public infrastructure, and that's one of the excitement about being part of this committee, and working with all of you is to do it in a way that is respectful of the communities and be able to bring services closer to our customers. The second thing that is important is timing. How long does it take to actually build a network? I really don't know. My CEO looks at me with a funny look every time I tell him when I build a small cell, it could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, and it depends. When the South Korean built the 5G infrastructure for the Olympics, the coming Winter Olympics, it took them 4 to 6 months. And why can't we do the same if we're trying to build and be the leader, a world leader in 5G networks? So I think timing is something that is important to make it more predictable. And the last one is fees. We need a more streamlined fee structure. We're not expecting it to be done for free, but it has to be streamlined. There are poles that cost us a lot more money than building it. And the equipment itself, and there are some in certain municipalities that doesn't. So a streamlined process with regards to fees would be very helpful.
Thank you, John. Ken?
Sure, thank you. Picking up a little bit on John's comments, we're in an environment now, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone sitting around the table, that there is exponential growth in terms of demand for data, whether that data is transmitted by wireline or wireless. We're in an environment where it is growing dramatically. And so providing infrastructure that can handle that level of data together with speed for deployment is becoming ever more critical with each passing day. So to that end, I am very appreciative to the chairman, the other commissioners for convening this committee and giving us the opportunity to weigh in on those issues. To John's comment about speed, I will tell you at Crown Castle, when our customers talk to us about how long it's going to take to deploy small cells, we tell them on average it's running about 18 to 24 months. And the primary reason for that length of delay is because of regulatory challenges that we face. If we are going to meet this ever-increasing demand for data and the timing requirements that are going to be placed upon us, the need for streamlining, that is the main focus of this committee, is absolutely critical. And it is extremely important that we work together to find ways to provide that correct balance between being respectful of the communities in which we are deploying equipment and at the same time finding a way to have equipment deployed quickly so that we can support or provide the infrastructure support that's needed. I really believe there are creative ways to do exactly that, and to start to think about things a little differently than we have in the past that can get us to that end result. But my guess is we will all be challenged to come forward and work together to try to find solutions that will allow us to have a path forward to meet the challenges in that kind of environment.
Thank you, Ken.
Really interesting inflection point right now. Listening about mobile and broadband, we're still reliant on 94% of the internet traffic globally on fixed networks. And we talk a lot about mobility, and so much of the efforts of the industry are going into that. I like to look back a little bit. I started in the DSL industry and then moved into the fiber industry, and now focusing on fixed wireless broadband. Back in the day when we were really deploying heavily in broadband, obviously it was designed around the copper networks and where we're at. And that was also because the cost of those networks was extremely low. So the affordability, to Commissioner Clyburn's credit, drives everything, not just with the consumer base, but with investment into broadband. We have since moved to a much, much higher cost of deploy, both for fiber and for mobile. We're at a point right now where we're at 100x the price of a mobile gigabyte than a fixed gigabyte of what we pay. And that's something that is very, very difficult to rationalize as we moved into the how do we improve our broadband world. Most of my time is spent going around to municipalities explaining, as we're trying to migrate bits to the wireless world, if they couldn't afford fiber, There's very little education in cities and working with utility companies about what does this look like? How big are these antennas going to be? Most of our time is spent on that. So I'd like to see a couple things happen here. Lots of flexibility in the types of technologies that are used. There are many different answers and flavors of wireless. We're very dependent on fiber, and we need to see the rights of ways for both very well handled, and keeping the costs of the process side have to be there, because if we don't do that, we can't take advantage of these great innovations that are happening that are lowering the cost of the CapEx side. So if we're spending all of our time preparing all of this and money, we're not going quickly, even whether you're equipment side or ISPs. We can't move fast enough because we're not educating cities fast enough as well. So, thanks.
Thank you. Chris?
So obviously, being the role I'm in, the whole deployment of broadband is near and dear to my heart. As far as when it comes to cost, comes to timing, speed, regulatory issues. I've lived in the South, I've lived in the Northeast, I've lived in the Midwest, and what I've learned through that is that everywhere I go, it's a little bit different spin as far as how you get your sites built. And we've worked through that historically over time. We've built macro networks, and many companies have done that, and we've kind of figured that game out. I think as we move over to the small cell world, it's very different, because we're basically asking to put those macros, little short macros everywhere. I mean, look at the numbers that are out there. We're talking about from where we are to 2020, 10 times the data need and the data usage. That's pretty big. And every one of us in this room, we want faster data speeds. We want better service. We want more features. We want our phone to work all the time, everywhere. Right? Everybody has that same approach. But as we think about deploying small cells, it's not quite that simple. If I look across the area that I have, I can go from town to town, and it's a tale of a different city. And that's tough when you're talking about, hey, our end user, the person using our phone, they want service, and they want it at this particular speed, and they want it in this particular area. And then when I go to deploy it, it's a problem, or there's some kind of regulatory concern, or the predictability that we talked about, John talked about. That's very important. We're all building capital budgets, and we all manage unit cost, and we manage timelines, and they're in big numbers. And I think it's no surprise to anyone in here that AT&T spends billions of dollars on infrastructure build every single year. And as we do that with this next phase of small cells, we've got to simply figure out how we use the infrastructure that's possibly there, and then how we deploy in places that it's not. In Chicago, I built quite a few small cells a few years ago. I needed this demand. This demand was already there for me. So I built quite a few of these a few years ago. And one of the things we did was sit down with Chicago and say, hey, we know you don't want these everywhere, but this is our full plan. This is our network, as you mentioned. This is what we want to build. And I think we got credibility because we never really deviated from when we sat down and said, this is what we're going to build. And if we did deviate, we'd go back to the city and say, hey, this is what we need and here's why. And I think that piece is very important. If I look at my particular town that I live in, they would never allow a small cell or even a macro. But times are changing, and everyone wants the service. So I'm very interested to work through this because it's all near and dear to my heart, and I know it is to the folks on this committee. But I believe we can come to some middle ground here, but it will be challenging. So looking forward to it.
Thank you, Chris. Kelly?
I just want to echo what you just said, Chris, and I totally agree with everything you said, and John and Ken, both of you as well. It seems to me like we have a problem of needing to educate the players in this area and in the field, because right now our company is experiencing 180. We're right at 180 days on trying to get an amendment to our franchise agreement in a major American city for small cell. because the key decision makers at the municipal level do not understand small cell. And it's going through all of these processes, and we're at 180 days. Another major American city has told us they've placed a moratorium on deployment of small cell, even though we are a public utility in the state and where we're seeking to deploy. So I think education of these decision makers is very important. And Karen and I were talking this morning about the need to balance everyone's interests. But another component of the education needs to be where we go to these folks that are in government and say, look, what are we talking about here? You want to talk about infrastructure and bridges and roads? These are the bridges and roads of the 21st century. I mean, this is the shovel-ready stuff that's going to make your state or your city ready for companies to come and hire people. And so this is infrastructure development just as anything else, any road that you could pave. So I think going to these people and talking about exactly what we're doing and looking at us as a way to help facilitate that deployment and that development of their community is going to be key. And in addition, John, you were talking about the expense. And I think another way that we want to go to these key decision makers at the state, municipal, and utility levels is to see if they could change their perspective on the way they look at the providers of broadband, as opposed to saying, all right, well, here's a company, and they want to come in and they want to deploy right now. We're going to charge them thousands of dollars up front and a cost per linear foot if it's putting in fiber, and other excessive permitting fees in addition to the slowdown. Maybe look at it from a different perspective of cutting fees up front and maybe looking at another billing model, say on a percentage of gross per quarter, and then that would facilitate more deployment for a longer period of time. So I think all of that is going to be key in talking to decision makers as we go forward and changing some attitudes about this and about our industry, about what we want to do as we provide to citizens and develop the networks as we go forward. Thank you.
Christopher?
Statement because I think he's hit an important point. You asked what we want the BEAD Act to do. I think education is a critical role. Telling people what's on the cutting edge is important. Once upon a time, long ago, I was in marketing for Procter & Gamble, and we were told that all marketing pitches boil down to one of two things. Do this and you will thrive, or don't do this and you will die. On some level, motivating decision makers will take the form of both. Some are trying to become urban leaders, and others are deathly afraid of being left behind by their peers, and you point to success stories by people out in front of them, and you worry. There's an interesting function we're going to have to do, and I think we have the time to motivate them to do that. But there's a different dimension to the education, which is quite interesting to me, which is I hear a lot of different conversations about different problems that we need to analyze separately. For 5G and new technologies, we're often talking about urban dense deployments which already are served, and it's how we're going to make that work. At the same time, we have a separate conversation about rural areas for which no legacy infrastructure is working at all, and how do we make that work. Those are very different conversations, both within the remit that may require different solutions in terms of the model code, which clearly is targeted at our charge to deal with municipalities of different kinds. And I want to make sure that we think through when we do this that we're going to have a very complex set of problems about how to deal with those issues. And there's also different issues in different cycles. One, there's areas that don't have service. There's areas that have very thin service where the goal is to introduce more options. And there's other places where you're maturing from a point where the demand has gotten sufficient to support multiple options, and you're actually maybe in a position to think about pulling off some of the regulations that we did to induce competitions in the first place, all of which are separate policy issues that we need to think about, because we're going to have to meet cities where we find them, basically, and think about this. The other thing that's quite striking to me is I'm talking with people who are actually deploying primarily in developing world countries, and there's actually two entirely separate problems which will play out differently. One is, some places the problem is CapEx, in other places the problem is OpEx. And in and for marginal communities and affordability, one of the things that strikes me is how we structure this is very, very complicated. And there is a fundamental tension between build-out and affordability in terms of revenue and keeping prices down and keeping it up. And that's something that actually I think is dynamic across different contexts. And understanding that that's the case is a problem, is a challenge, I think, and it's going to inform a lot of the work we do. And so I think that thinking about how we make this work for all the different constituencies, and the last constituency I'll throw on the table is, when I hear the word preemption, one of the key stakeholders here, which is represented in part, but other people, I think, is a perspective we have to internalize, is the municipalities hear preemption and they hear not just a quick change in their sovereignty and their control, but frankly, franchise fees are revenue. And we have to take seriously a way to make this work for all of the key stakeholders who have to sign off on this to make it happen, and to take seriously that as we adjust this is going to have impacts on every actor in the system, and understand that we're going to compromise and to create a workable solution where, what's the perfect idea of a compromise? Everyone goes away a little unhappy, but you find something everyone can live with. And I think we're all going to face that issue and hopefully approach it in the spirit of trying to find a workable compromise, because if what we propose as a non-starter, we will have put a lot of time and energy for something that will be an interesting but ultimately empty exercise. And I think I know at this point this is the time to aspire to better, and I think that I'm confident that if we approach this the right way, we can do that.
Thank you, Christopher. Betsy.
Betsy Huber, National Grange. I guess I'm the agricultural representative on the committee. So I need to mention the explosion of technology in agriculture. From livestock, we have robotic milking machines, to self-driving tractors, harvesting equipment that has computers, and just the data that's being collected that needs to be useful to the farmer whose income is down. Farm income is down everywhere with milk prices and commodity prices. So we need to improve the economic situation of our farmers, because we'll need to feed 9 billion people by 2050. And I would rather have my food come from the United States than overseas. So this all wraps into the necessity of broadband for the rural areas where there's not the density. So that's, I guess, my position on the board, to remind you of the farmers and the rural areas. And then we still have members. Our Grange members are mainly rural areas or very small towns, and we still have people who students have to go to the library or the McDonald's parking lot to do their homework. So just bring that up.
Thank you, Betsy. Mark?
So I think one of the common themes that I've heard from the group, is really how does standardization help remove frictions to deployment, whether that's on the wireless or wireline side. And I just want to share for a minute what we've seen in Detroit. It's kind of an interesting story. I'm sure one that you've all heard or been through yourselves before, but Rocket fiber encompasses about a 7 square mile footprint in the what we call the commercial corridor or greater downtown Detroit area. So pretty small footprint. About 30,000 people live in that area, and about 180 to 200,000 daily commuters in and outside of that footprint. That's where we're active. We built a dense fiber network within that footprint, and even though it's only 7 square miles, we're dealing with 3 separate pole owning or controlling entities. One being the city of Detroit, one being our local utility company, and the third being a new state-created entity called the Public Lighting Authority of Detroit. And that was part of the high-profile bankruptcy that we recently went through about 4 years ago. The city's finances were not in a shape that they could actually rebuild the public lighting grid. At the time, about 50% of all of our streetlights in the city of Detroit were out. So the state of Michigan stepped in. They backed this new authority, and 65,000 brand new wooden utility poles went in the city of Detroit, completely revamped the lighting grid. So 3 separate entities, 3 very different negotiations for Rocket Fiber to get access to that infrastructure. At the city level, echoing some of the other comments, a very willing and very motivated partner to help us, but lacking really the resources or expertise to know what a new broadband deployment looked like, because it had been almost 15 to 20 years since somebody actually started building new network in the city. On the utility side, Michigan is one of the few states that has opted out of the FCC pole rule set. We regulate our own poles. We have really great rates, but we have no shot clock. So I'll just say that it was a very time-consuming process. We've built very good bridges with our utility company and have smoothed that process out, but took almost a full calendar year from our first set of permits to the time we were actually on the poles. And now, as we look to grow outside of the greater downtown Detroit area and get out into the neighborhoods where I alluded, is really where this massive digital divide. 60% of our residents have no fixed line broadband access at home. We know we can't do it with just fiber alone. We cannot build fiber to every home in the city of Detroit. There's no way we'll raise the capital to do that, and then even if we could, it's a losing business proposition. So we're looking at other technologies. We've been pretty active in wireless for about 6 months now, trying to experiment and figure out what that deployment model looks like, and even on that front, again, running into a lot of permitting, zoning, historic issues that we're still trying to work our way through. So from our perspective, standardization and recommendations around how municipalities and other entities that control the infrastructure, I think, would go a long way, and that's really what we're here for.
Thank you, Mark. Carlos?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to follow up on, and this is Carlos from LGBT Technology Partnership and Institute. I wanted to follow up on what Betsy was talking about, because rural communities is one of the areas that we're very focused on. Our path to the BDAC started with a lot of meetings with Chairman Pai regarding the digital divide and issues about underserved and unserved communities. Research that we have done have shown that LGBT communities are earlier adopters of technology than other communities and rely on technology in a much greater way for health information, for information about identity, and for social networks. These issues are compounded when you're in a rural community that doesn't have broadband access. You may feel very alone. You may feel like you don't have any options. So for us, the deployment of broadband in rural communities and underserved communities is literally could be a matter, a lifeline for LGBT communities in these areas. So we've done a lot of work with rural communities in order to educate them and make sure that there is access. The other side of the coin is that we also feel that having broadband gives LGBT members in rural communities and other underserved communities the opportunity to start their own businesses and use entrepreneurship to control their own destinies. We find that there are not a lot of opportunities. A lot of people may not be out or may not be maybe underemployed because of their sexual orientation. And we feel that broadband deployment and access to broadband can help these people start their own businesses and take their own economic future into their hands. So that's our kind of involvement with rural communities and underserved communities.
Thank you. Brent?
I'll try to be brief. So I don't build networks. I'm a lawyer. I study regulation and I study networks. But But my interest in the committee and what the chairman has proposed is that lawmakers and this commission has been a force for good when it comes to expanding entry into competitive markets. And a few instances come to mind. Often it's individuals. So Clay T. Whitehead and Nixon White House developed the Open Skies policy, which basically, instead of the AT&T federal government satellite monopoly, opened up satellite to companies who fit various criteria, and that gave directly. It really helped the cable industry develop in the 70s and 80s. I think of the Telecom Act, and there was a lot of interest in local networks, unbundling networks, and really the biggest competitive entry was from cable VoIP, and that was not foreseen, and that was a pretty simple statute, just let cable VoIP into the telephone market, and certainly wireless. So ILECs have lost 100 million residential subscribers in 15 years. A lot of that's wireless, a lot of that's cable VoIP, and so my interest in this, and I hope in a small way I can contribute, is when there is competitive entry and when consumers have choice and feel they have choice, the demand for more onerous regulation goes down substantially, and I hope we can accomplish that.
Thank you. Karen?
So again, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I was really excited when I received the opportunity to sit on this committee. I think that just listening to everyone around the room, we're all here for one common purpose, and it's just about listening to each other. My colleague on the Model Codes Committee, he was right in terms of education, but it's also language and how we talk about these issues. So I'm from Massachusetts, and the word preemption scares me. But I think if you talk about it in another way to states and municipalities, they get it, because like my neighbor Brian said earlier, they all want broadband. So again, it's just talking to municipalities, states, and others in terms of how we sort of do this collectively, because we're all here for one purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Milo?
Thank you. I think, in my experience, a lot of times communities don't necessarily understand implications of their rules and processes on bills. And when you get together and actually explain things, you can generally work things out. That said, there's a wide range of challenges to deal with, and I think we have an opportunity to actually put a lot of experience together, bridge gaps in knowledge and information, and help people understand implications, both on the construction side as well as on the city side. Because I think everybody benefits from lower cost infrastructure. You get more investment, and in the end, consumers will have more choice. And I think that's something we should all strive for.
Thank you. Douglas?
Anything I've heard so far that I don't agree with. But there's a couple things I wanted to echo, and one is education. It's critical, and as the last speaker just said, the commissioner said, speaking the same language or figuring out definition, speaking language. Mark Ganzi mentioned that as well. I will mention one thing. New York City has underserved areas, so. There are perspectives that we have. I know that I have that I don't, that they're not fully informed. So it's educating ourselves and then educating the constituencies that we represent that's going to be so critical. But I am also very excited about what we can do as a committee to inform the commission and how we're going to succeed. Because I think Jonathan mentioned, other than perhaps Korea and other certain discrete areas or countries around the globe. We really do have one of the most robust network infrastructures in the world, and I think in many ways the world is watching, so I'm excited about it like everybody else.
Thank you. Valerie?
Thank you. Why am I here is because I want to see a chicken in every pot and a gig to every home. To me, that's the ultimate broadband dream. But seriously, my perspective here is as a representative of the Coeur d'Alene tribe and a person who has deployed broadband on my reservation for over a decade. I've experienced many of the same barriers with the different types of municipalities and the electric companies, co-ops. My reservation is 345,000 acres. We have 4 primary communities and several lake communities. And we have to go out and explain to each and every stakeholder who lives on the reservation, the type of system that we're deploying, whether it be the wireless tower or whether it be, getting joint use agreements and placing poles or digging underground. And the thing that I found with local municipalities is when you get their permission, then they get election, you have to go get permission all over again. And, so it can kill an entire construction season. So I understand the frustrations that everyone has gone through. I've felt those pain. But I think there's a way to deploy broadband without tears and without stepping on people's toes, and that, making everyone in every local area understand that it is a win-win situation and broadband is good for you. It's not just all about zeros and ones. It's about the content and the education, all the benefits that the local people can get from it. So I think, part of that education process is every person wants to know what's in it for me. So it's up to us to help maybe demonstrate to them, what the benefits are to them if they don't already know. Thank you.
Thank you. Dolan?
Yeah, so I appreciate all the feedback and nothing taken personally. So speaking for San Jose, I think we're going to be a good partner at the table. We're urban, highly urban in a small area. We're urban in a lot of area. We're suburban and we're rural all at the same time. We have our digital infrastructure is significantly below average. Residential home internet, the average is about 50 megabits per second. We're 40 if you take speedtest.net as the benchmark. On our mobile side, the average is 22 megabits per second in the nation. Ours is about 11 on average, and the median is 7. So I'm echoing the reality of where the cities are is we look at that and we think we need to improve our digital infrastructure. In fact, we have engaged a large project to develop our digital infrastructure strategy, and we're about mid-flight. I every day look at the number of small cell permits that are in flight and remain in flight, the number that are completed, the number that are in backlog, and completely agree with you. There are processes that need to be streamlined. There are pricing structures that need to be changed to promote broadband, and we're ready to come to the table to have those discussions. So we look forward. I'm speaking for the mayor, so it's easy for me to say that, but I meet with the mayor quite often. I meet with our Public Works Department every day, so I have a pretty good feeling between execution and aspiration and policy, and we look forward to working with you and figuring out ways to accelerate the deployment of broadband.
Thank you. Thank you to all the committee members for sharing your perspective. It's clear we have a very diverse representation of experience and knowledge and perspectives, and I think, though, the other thing that's clear is a very common agenda, and that diversity will contribute to a better outcome in achieving our common agenda. I want to thank everyone for being here today, especially thank Brian and Paul for being our arms and legs, organizing all of this activity. I know that both Kelly and I are very anxious to get going, and we're here to support and help in every way we can the working groups as well as participate. So with that, I think we're ready to adjourn. It's been a great first meeting, and we look forward to seeing you all again and talking to you soon. Thank you.
All right.